what makes an action worth using our military. At some point, our grandparents decided to join up and fight. So what changed with my generation and subsequent generations, our world has been turned upside down from the perspective of the greatest generation. And I wonder, can it be saved? Welcome to the Rundown Report. As a rundown mom, I have questions about many big things. I rarely find answers. Here's where I try to understand the world. Consider supporting my work by becoming a paid subscriber to Lightning Up and the Rundown Report on Substack. Hello, and welcome back to the Rundown Report. This is S.H. Jacobs. I've been working on another update to the Minnesota fraud situation since so much has happened recently, but that's going to wait for another time. Before we get started, I want to apologize for the sound of my voice in this. I've been having some problems with enunciating my words just due to some problems I've had. So I apologize for that in advance. Today I'll be talking about how I spent most of my life opposing war despite my relatives' participation in war and the military. After many years, I have shifted to think about what makes a war justifiable. Many people in my life have served in the military, some fighting in battles. Many relatives of my grandparents' generation did not hesitate to volunteer, but my parents' generation had fewer volunteers for the military, and with the institution of the draft during Vietnam, a very large anti-war movement grew throughout America. The Vietnam War was to oppose the spread of communism. The idea of fighting a war for an ideology or to oppose an ideology didn't make sense to people. However, my parents' generation were raised to reflexively hate communism. The 50s posed communism as the largest threat and used jingoism and patriotic fervor to indoctrinate the youth. For many, this created a backlash that exploded in the 1960s, when these kids grew up to question their worldview, leading to later opposition to the reason for the Vietnam War. As this movement to leave behind the burden of Western thought, which mostly involved an overwhelming sense of responsibility for one's choices in the world, the boomers moved from rebellious, dropped-out hippies who stood for equality and peace to those who saw that peace was only possible through a revolution. In other words, the boomers rediscovered communism and Marxism, which makes sense when you realize that America always raised them to feel that with the correct ideology in place, as in 1776, or with the Civil War's opposition to slavery, a justified war was possible. If one could throw off the shackles of monarchy and aristocracy for a democratic republic and meritocracy through war, and one bought into the idea of moral progress, and one is encouraged to see Marxism as forbidden knowledge, the natural progression, it seems, for the boomers became discovering a new revolution to shift the conversation from equality to equity, enforced violent overthrow of the system that seeks to oppress the economic interests of the few for a minority of capitalists. So, overthrowing the capitalistic system. So maybe the linkage of the anti-war movement to leftist Marxism was inevitable. The strong anti-war movement that developed in the 70s still lives today. And thinking about what I see in America, particularly since the 2010s, it is not that all of the movements we see influencing American culture are communist. However, linking violent, active revolution with achieving political ends in an overthrow of the current status is Marxism, or derived from it. My generation, Generation X, distrusted war, militarism, and patriotism more than they distrusted communism. So today, I reflect on America's growing leftist ideology, which has shaped our response to law enforcement and military, and driven many of the protests today. Many are portraying America as villains, while oppressive governments like those in Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba are portrayed as victims. How did we get here? I just wanted to understand why my point of view has changed over the years. What is different? And what is a just war? And especially since there wasn't a provocation with this new invasion of Iran. Iran didn't send missiles towards America immediately before our attack, though they've been provoking us for decades. I've been reflecting on how my grandparents' generation viewed America. When we think of a justifiable war, we automatically think of World War II and the Nazis' atrocities. Even the anti-American academic Noam Chomsky believed that World War II, America's entrance into the war, was justifiable, and most people in America today would agree. However, America's entrance into the war, though noble, has been revised to suit our self-image. In World War II, there were a number of pro-Nazi people within the United States, some who had been influenced by external forces to support Hitler and ignore the news reported about the atrocities against Jews in Europe. A Gallup poll that was conducted in 1939 asked Americans if we should declare war on Germany and send troops because they had already invaded. 90% of Americans at that time said we should not. It wasn't until 1941 that the U.S. joined the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and I'll share a little story about that. But before that time, 1.5 million Jews were systematically murdered under the Nazis' unchecked power. We can discuss the rise of despotic regimes across the world who have killed their people today. Chief among these regimes is Iran, who most recently murdered 30,000 protesters just since January. At what point do we say that is enough? The truth is, at some point, our grandparents decided to join up and fight. I started to consider what their lives were like, and none of my or my husband's relatives had easy lives. Still, they believed enough in the future, despite starving and having little to no prospects. They believed in America enough to sign up. So I need to consider what changed with my generation and subsequent generations that we no longer feel or uphold patriotism. Though we saw a defeat of communism with the fall of the USSR and the opening of China, our universities were full of leftists who not only grew louder after Vietnam, their theories have been considered not only viable, but primary today in the social sciences. Thus, today, though we know about the atrocities of Iran, its treatment of women and children and dissidents, we deny those facts and the testimony to uphold a stubborn ideology that America is now the pinnacle of evil. In other words, our world has been turned upside down from the perspective of the greatest generation, and I wonder, can it be saved? I started thinking about this after my sisters-in-law told me a story about my husband's grandfather who was a Navy pilot. Apparently, he was supposed to be at Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack. Instead, he was sent out on the USS Indianapolis and he survived. Now later, he was shot down and sent home, and that's where he met my husband's grandmother. And it's also how he avoided being on the USS Indianapolis when it was sunk. That sinking left very few survivors in 1945. Those survivors floated in the Pacific Ocean, stranded and trying to avoid being eaten by sharks before some were rescued. I was left thinking about how close my husband came to not existing had his grandfather suffered other fates. So he was someone who joined the military before America declared war. There were many like him, despite polling that indicated America believed in isolationism. In my family, my grandma's brothers joined, my grandpa joined, and many others as well. My husband's grandpa was not alone in feeling that America had a duty to protect against tyranny in the world, not just at home. My daughter popped up from nowhere during this story and was amazed that her grandpa was on the USS Indianapolis. I was amazed to listen to her discuss the ship, and my daughter's interest in military history was surprising. It suggested a very different perspective than her Gen X parents or her boomer grandparents. Years before, she had gone on a class trip to Washington, D.C. and returned interested in veterans in our family because she had studied wars during that visit. Volunteering to fight in a war or fighting wars in general is very foreign to our kids' generation. They've grown up in peace. For many kids today, anything about the military is outside the realm of understanding and experience, at least until this last year. And this is very different for my generation. In contrast, the greatest generation experienced the deprivation of the Great Depression. Many volunteered for military service in World War II, oftentimes, as with my husband's grandfather, before the U.S. even officially joined the war. This is different from what my kids experience. To many kids, war is a relic of the past. For me, war and military service often carry negative consequences only. The challenge of history is you can't see what didn't happen. You can't see the past thwarted by stopping the Nazis or Imperial Japan. You can only see what was left behind afterwards. You can only see the world now as a product of American hegemony, with the negative consequences and mistakes more visible than the peace and stability that has defined at least my entire life. That peace and stability was born on the backs of people who died, people who fought, including my grandfather, who suffered greatly during World War II. In my family, while my husband's grandfather was flying for the Navy, my grandpa had entered the war in Germany, where he was captured and ended up in a POW camp, for which he was later awarded a Purple Heart. My grandfather didn't speak about his experiences in the POW camp. Once he was reported to say that the Germans treated people worse than dogs. Later in his life, after my grandmother died when she was only 47, he had really bad nightmares. Maybe it was what we would call PTSD. He would just scream in his sleep, waking us up in the night. One time, he jumped out of his closed window to get away while sleeping and hurt himself. I don't know what happened to him, but it must have been terrible. But I think this most likely made me see military service negatively, even as my dad had joined the Air Force Reserves.
My dad was proud of his service, even if he initially intended to go to college. College didn't work for him, but the military life did. I assume he worked on matters related to the Iron Curtain and communism in Eastern Europe, as he spoke of fighting the Pinko commies.
He served first in Germany and then later occasionally took trips while serving on the weekends. I didn't take as much of an interest in his service, unfortunately, as I had no idea what he did other than radar. My dad had got a lot of his training through the military with coursework that allowed him to work in medical imaging for most of his life. For people from lower middle class backgrounds, military service was a means to get ahead. Yet something had changed by the time my generation, Gen X, became adults. People still volunteered for military service, but fewer, and only as a means to pay for college. College became a larger means to develop skills and training than the military was. After all, Gen X watched the boomers' response to the Vietnam War. You could see the fallout of the Vietnam War in everybody's neighborhood. Growing up as a Gen X kid, you saw many veterans with serious problems. Veterans had alcohol problems, family issues, abuse. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of people returned from the war damaged. Vietnam veterans were often rejected by an anti-war movement that had grown in the United States. Indeed, the effects of Vietnam veterans in my life influenced my distrust of the military. Now, this put me at odds with my father, who was in the Air Force and was very supportive of the military despite what we saw around us.
Like many who rejected the anti-war movement of other boomers, my dad was a more moderate conservative who supported Reagan. Though this conservatism was common in the 80s, music, movies, and even some teachers clung to and promoted the boomer anti-war New Left message.
Many movies were set to portray the most terrible things about war, but it also had the effect of making it so that many in Gen X and subsequent generations didn't think there was ever a good reason for fighting and thought that all problems in the world ought to be solved through diplomacy only. Except we always had World War II in the image of the Nazis and what could happen with a totalitarian regime as evidence of justified war. The picture one got growing up in the 80s was that if you went to war, if you signed up, you were a fool, a pawn in the game of the elites who would use you as cannon fodder to make money off of war profiteering. People who volunteered to serve were portrayed as either victims of poverty or less intelligent than people who chose to go to college. The other side of the boomer narrative, the anti-war side, was foreign to my upbringing. However, the anti-war movement, the pacifist hippie movement was something my husband grew up in. So my husband was surrounded by those who were anti-war, political, opposed to military-industrial complex, pro-commune, anti-Christian, organic agriculture, early feminists, and basically the ideas that you see everywhere now on the left. He grew up with people preaching the ideas now propagating in the leftist movements. I was interested in these ideas about American imperial hegemony and those who remained in the margins despite radical social changes and growth of the middle class. Yet, by the time I met him, I had encountered a few leftists. Due to most joining the workforce and starting families, most Democrats I knew in Wisconsin or Minnesota either were old school farmers or had been to college. They held ideology that would be called right-wing today. They believed in strong enforcement of law and order and immigration. They supported technological growth and international free markets. However, they supported increased spending for education, especially higher education, and that set them apart from the Republicans of the time. It wasn't until my family moved to Houston, Texas, that I met many radicals at my upper middle class high school, where there were kids of doctors and kids of executives at Enron or people who had parents that worked at Exxon. These kids lived in large, nice houses with fancy pools. They introduced me to Orwell, Marx, and gender bending, but mostly spent their time and money scoring drugs, which I avoided, convinced I would become instantly hooked. This was the first, but not the last time I would see that the most radical people never had to worry about money. Indeed, a number of boomers my husband grew up around had left their wealthy families to join communes or environmentalist enclaves in the upper Midwest. An old friend had a name for these types when we went to college: Trustafarians. These were the dreadlocked white hippies that followed the dead, or later fish, their puka shell necklaces and their trust funds, and they espoused communist beliefs as long as it allowed everyone to share in the bong hits. More Americans were exposed to increasing leftism inside an academic world that was propped up by public funding.
Many of these anti-war boomers moved into higher education, becoming professors. Their ideas were taught to college students, but mostly were discounted as too radical for mainstream consumption.
In the 90s and in the early 2000s even, the returns that someone got from investing in a college education were much higher. And after that point, students were burdened by the debts that they were told to take out for an education that was going to eventually get them jobs that would pay that debt off. It just didn't turn out, and the universities continued to profit off the system. So people started to shift even further left. And this ended up creating a majority of people who blame the government for failing to aid in this crisis and failing to stop it, to have a more socialistic government to help out with students who are facing a debt crisis. Inside of this academic world that was thriving thanks to student loans that were burgeoning and putting many, many students in debt, the leftist rhetoric increased only during that time. So while people were becoming more indebted to the government, they began to listen to people who talked to them about changes in wealth inequality. And inside of the academy, you had people using more Marxist or identity-based theories to back up a lot of the social sciences. All negative things about human history fell into a unitheory where America is a country subservient to the wealthy white capitalists whose money was marred with the blood of the oppressed minorities and the poor and the enslaved. Now, when I came across this information in college, I was interested in the rhetorical techniques, as the people that used these arguments, they were convincing because the oppressor narrative is coherent. And in education, you're taught to value coherence. But these theories do not actually reflect reality. The coherence of the oppressor narrative used by many on the left needs to ignore all the positive things produced by the evil oppressor, such as equality, human rights, democracy, the relationship of Christianity to many of these concepts, the better treatment of children and women and the disabled. The oppressor narrative also must ignore problems inside the oppressed populations, where negative traits propagate just as they do in every single population of humans. Traits such as greed, anger, violence occur in every human population, regardless of their identity. So the oppressor narrative can remain coherent only if it ignores all the exceptions to the rule, of which there are many. And so the oppressor unitheory that's used everywhere today to further leftist narratives falls apart when it faces actual history and reality. The bigger question is, how did these ideas overtake others in society? Inside academia since the 70s, the traditional ideas and conservatism weren't as convincing. Most conservatives were going to just promote pro-Americanism and reject anything different as anti-American. The conservatives I grew up with and that I knew in college weren't as interested in challenging their worldviews. Conservatism was then the realm of the elites. People who didn't belong or rejected their ideas were looked down on, as those of wealth and power during that time ascribed to this view. They no longer focused on persuasion. Worse, conservatives often pushed censorship of culture, moral sermonizing, and equating all that was good with white European Protestant virtue. This left out many Americans who were accepted by the Democratic Party. The Democrats had floundered since Carter's presidency, but the leftist ideology thrived in the countercultural spheres and in the arts. Those people that wrote books, scripts, plays, magazines, news, music, any sort of media have primarily been people who have leaned leftward. By the 90s, with the Clinton presidency and the Big Tent Democrats accepting a multicultural America, we were moving towards this idea of a world where things like communism were not a threat. They were just one of many different ideas, where American imperialism and hegemony were more problematic than the idea of an international communist rule. Today, people opposed to the Iran or Venezuela invasion argue against what they've been taught or what they see as imperialism. For instance, when America got oil from Venezuela, people proclaim that, oh, see, America's doing what they always have done, which is go into land, take away any resources they want, leave the people there hanging by a thread. We're just doing imperialism all over again. But is that actually what is happening? You could argue, and many people inside of Venezuela have argued that, China and Russia have already done that. In some ways, it was worse. They took oil, and the money didn't get to the people, and China and Russia were fine with that. China and Russia and other places, such as Iran, embrace imperialism while using arguments about imperialism against us. Opening Venezuela to trade might provide Venezuela with more money than they've seen for some time. And it'll be a good thing for the Venezuelan people. I can't say that it's 100% going to work out, but it seems to be that the Venezuelan people would be happier. And this is the thing that clued me into reflecting about where things had gone astray. Because if you listen to people from Venezuela and from Iran who are speaking in the media, they actually support our current war efforts with large majorities. My understanding of leftist views was that it was in line with democracy, that we were going to listen to people, we were going to listen to those who had been oppressed. This is where right now I'm a little bit confused, because you just have to ignore a whole bunch of important facts or statements in order to uphold your ultimate ideas. And in this case, you have to ignore what a majority of the people in Iran and Cuba and Venezuela want in order to justify your opposition to the war and your opposition to America, who is the bad guy. But to return to the topic, the criticism of American imperialism grew in the academic world and spread throughout the education and legal system in America, with left-leaning educators and lawyers that have shifted America quite a bit in the last 10, 15 years. The military was viewed as just another way to enforce our Western hegemony. Even if you weren't a leftist, the boomers and Gen X didn't really pay a lot of attention to history in school or got a biased version of it, and they were usually blindsided when they came to college, especially when it presented all of America's faults. Very few people encountered or presented balanced views. These alternative projects often radicalized many. In these theories, a just war is never possible if it upheld the current power structure. These ideas influenced me and others so that by the time the Iraq War happened, even after 9/11, when war hawks promoted rumors of weapons of mass destruction, and we continued to see American soldiers die without a clear timeline for withdrawal, this led to people protesting the war and demanding change in our political structure. Eventually, it led to Barack Obama coming into power, promising unification rather than division and international diplomacy above barbaric militarism. In reality, military actions continued behind the scenes, with many of the pleasant things happening and buried under this veneer of diplomacy and ideas of international law, which is only enforceable with monetary and military backing, mostly from the United States. So, in effect, it doesn't actually exist. After Obama, when Trump won against Clinton, many movements that were once separate collapsed into one, wherein people said all oppressed people fought for the same thing. People who were once divided came together to fight the new enemy, Donald Trump. Today, after two unpredicted wins by Donald Trump, the left view him and his followers as the largest threat to America in our history. Those to the farthest right were used as emblematic of Trump's followers and beliefs, though his actual stance and policies were similar to Bill Clinton's, more similar to his than the farthest right nitwits. In characterizing MAGA, it was determined that the median MAGA voter was a neo-Nazi, which meant that people who professed support, which tended to be white male Christians, were suspect unless they proved themselves at the new altar of woke. So, what was the new wokeness? Wokeness is possibly an overused term, but it functions like the word pornography. You know it when you see it, but it's hard to define. Mostly, it came from the grievances between various identity-based organizations such as Black Lives Matter or the women's movement and Me Too. Opposition to Obama had become linked with opposition to Obama's black ancestry, as his widely supported popular election brought out racists to be covered by the media. There were attempts made to link opposition to his policies to racism, especially when we saw the rise of Black Lives Matter, with high-profile cases like Trayvon Martin and Eric Gardner taking over the news. Having worked in academia at the time, the Obama presidency empowered many people to pressure administrators inside of public universities to do more to enforce affirmative action quotas and rectify the discrepancies For example, in the STEM fields, which had used merit-based admissions over identity considerations. Some of these new administrators wanted it to be identity considerations first, merit-based second. Administrators had to show what they were doing to address racial discrepancies within their field. Because now everyone was forced to accept that structural discrimination, racism, patriarchy, homophobia, and the newer idea of transphobia were enforcing economic disparities. The only solution then was to change one's standards, as if you didn't, you were a racist. No one wanted to be that. Slowly from that point and into the mainstream via social media's explosion and dispersion of once fringe or at least solely academic theory, we saw an increasing use of economic and social pressures to punish those who held different views from those on the left. Trump did not come from nowhere. Some of what got Trump labeled racist to begin with was his birther conspiracies pushing ideas that maybe Obama wasn't born in Hawaii and was thus ineligible to be president. Regardless, opposition to Obama and to Democratic policies were enforced with social pressure campaigns thanks to competing fake news and social media campaigns to get each side identified with the further right or left flanks. Republicans became Nazi racists and Democrats became communists. Still, there was a movement for the GOP to denounce the neo-Nazis and white supremacist supporters, but there was no acknowledgement that there was anything wrong for the Democrats with their Marxist or identity politics supporters. Rather, those people became empowered after Clinton lost to Trump. The same political circles associated Trump not with his policies, but with hatred of women, desire to stomp out all immigration, and support of actual prominent white supremacists. The theories and ideas many in academia had dismissed as disconnected from reality were introduced to everyone to back up reasons for canceling and destroying people's livelihoods. Law and order or criminal prosecution was not sufficient, as the entire American legal system was corrupted by its association with slavery, Jim Crow, and other laws that allowed for racial discrimination. Laws, after all, in our economic system upheld oppression of black and brown person throughout the globe. Likewise, at a time when our billionaires popped up everywhere, capitalism itself became suspect. If we looked at the richest people, white men, we could see that capitalism and the law upheld a racial and sex identity-based hierarchy. This hierarchy extended to the international fronts and allowed those who suffered the most at the hands of imperialist America to become victims, as each woman or gay or trans person was now a victim of the suspect capitalism and social racism within America. Wokeness, though, implied a movement to not only engage in peaceful protests, but to impose one's ideas onto another through force if necessary. After all, the consequences were existential, as Trumpian policy came to symbolize fascist totalitarianism. You didn't want the Nazis to win, in other words. Meanwhile, using force through widespread censorship and discrimination were acceptable solutions for the Democrats. Forcing the wealthiest and corporations to pay even more became the solution. So, though no one dared use the term Marxism or communism, and though no one called it totalitarian, many Democrats began to openly talk up socialism as a solution, particularly with medicine and education, though could be argued education had long ago been fully socialized. What unified all these disparate theories? The idea that the capitalist imperialist system alienated everyone from their true nature. In short, Marxism. But if you wanted to label something communist, thanks to the Red Scare and the anti-communist American propaganda, this was a sure way of getting people to ignore any criticism you had. Therefore, these authoritarian tendencies were eventually labeled woke. Yet wokeism demanded moral, economic, and ecological purity. You were no longer allowed to speak beliefs that went against the norm. Free speech, the bedrock of America, was in constant debate. Should we allow it? Because now speech could harm a person. One could experience harm by being called a name or being misgendered. Harm was widely accepted, with millennials and older Gen Z, as verbal. One needed to watch their words. If they said the wrong things, if they didn't follow the new norms, they may need to speak to human resources or look for another job or find a new university. anyone who supported men, heterosexuality, meritocracy, Christianity, capitalism, upward mobility, they were pushed out, which ended up pushing out a majority of Americans from the Democratic Party and from the left. As the purity test continued, those inside the LGBT and environmentalist movements were also questioned and pushed out. And who was left to scoop up all these people that had been ostracized? Donald Trump. One of the odder things that happened is during this massive polarization, the left and the Democratic Party, these people had become increasingly totalitarian.
Leftists voiced support of Hamas. They cheered China's wins in manufacturing and military. The Democratic Party listened.
But because Trump opposed these regimes, the left found justifications for, if not supporting them, then letting them continue in their actions. Inside these other countries, rulers had become increasingly totalitarian, controlling a large population through military threat, as with IRGC quashing multiple uprisings. In America, most people spoke out against Iran killing and imprisoning women and killing dissidents. In the recent past, there was always a sense that Iran's treatment of its people represented a line in the sand. People could never support Iran. But now I hear people promote the idea that Iran had a right to sovereignty, despite the majority of Iranian people lacking the right to govern themselves. We would never accept the slaughter of 30,000 protesters in America or any Western nation. In Minnesota, we had massive protests when 2 people were killed by officers. Riots. Most Iranian immigrants want to be able to go home and live in freedom. The protests that started in December through January were a response to failure within Iran, and some say millions protested, knowing full well that they could be killed. And the only way they were going to get help is through military aid. An illiberal dictatorial government, as in Iran or Venezuela or Cuba, that is willing to imprison dissidents and slaughter thousands, won't respond to anything else but force and military threat. And that's where I come back to my beginning. What wars are worth fighting? When people's freedom is absolutely at risk and they're dying in the thousands, then it seems that a war is worth fighting. I've talked about my family through almost 90 years and through a shift in thought within America about war and an anti-war movement that sides with America's foes. Its justification derived from postmodern theory loosely linked to Marxism. I've already bored you enough. Anyway, now I want to talk about the 2 worldviews that were on display at the recent international conferences, the WEF and the Munich Security Conference. On one side, you had representatives of the Trump administration, and on the other side, you had some representatives for the Democratic Party, and we'll call them the internationalists. The best example of the differences in ideology and view came from speeches given by Marco Rubio and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, Trump, despite what a lot of people actually think, he's not very ideological. He's more like a realpolitik businessman. He wants to see what works and he'll mostly talk to anybody. But he has chosen more ideologic members of his cabinet, such as Marco Rubio, a neoconservative neocon. So what did Marco Rubio say? When he discussed the fall of the Berlin Wall, he said, "But the euphoria of this triumph led us to a dangerous delusion that we had entered, quote, the end of history, that every nation would now be a liberal democracy, that the ties formed by trade and by commerce alone would now replace nationhood, that the rules-based global order, an overused term, would now replace the national interest, and that we would now live in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world," end quote. In response to the idea of security, Rubio said, "Fundamental question we must answer at the outset is what exactly are we defending? Because armies do not fight for abstractions. Armies fight for a people. Armies fight for a nation. Armies fight for a way of life. And that is what we are defending, a great civilization that has every reason to be proud of its history, confident of its future, and aims to always be the master of its own economic and political destiny." End quote. Though in America, we value the new, amazing creations from the combination of cultures and traditions from all over the world and our immigrant ancestors, we value literature, art, and architecture and music, some that we share with our European allies. As someone who studied literature and politics, I recognize, perhaps too late, that the movement away from appreciating anything European is pretty much insane. Rubio, in his speech to the Europeans who have felt a lot of animosity toward the Trump administration, Rubio emphasized our shared heritage, not in terms of anything like race, but talking about what we valued as worth preserving, like the equality inherent in Christianity, beauty, truth, freedom of speech. These are things that are of great value and have led to great things in the world, in Europe and in America. But we can only see them when they're threatened. Rubio's speech represented a recent renewal of the conservative ideal, which has found a voice inside the university that rejects its politics for the most part. Moderate conservatism also rejects the totalitarian right, which founds freedom, etc., in ideas of race and ethnicity, and rejects belief as much as the far left. In contrast, Ocasio-Cortez presented the argument for the left. In Munich, she dismissed the idea of culture, saying, and this is a quote, "They want to take this mantle of culture. At the end of the day, though, it's very thin." And so the responses that we have is, again, it's material, it's class-based, it's common interests, end quote. In other words, she said, shared culture are relative and downstream from one's identity and class, which oddly sounds like something that those on the far right would agree with. I recognize the ideas holding up her statement as related to a Marxist doctrine of historical materialism, but I disagree with her as much as I disagree with the far right. There are things worth preserving, and this may be what people on the left get wrong or don't see clearly about our own ancestors that fought in wars, or what the Trump administration is often badly trying to give voice to. In this case, Rubio did a great job. Rubio's statements sound more true than Ocasio-Cortez. There are things worth dying for, worth fighting for, worth preserving. There are wars that are worth fighting, and brave people will always fight for this positive vision and urge others to fight for their freedom. They're trying to protect what is good in our lives and what is valuable. Most soldiers don't join to kill those of other ethnicities. This is what Iran or Hamas told people to do. Kill the great Satan represented by Israel and America. This is what the Nazis did. Kill those who would oppose the domination of the Aryan man. And they lost. A positive vision, no matter how clouded, no matter how ineptly enacted, will drive American soldiers to join so that others can have freedoms that we enjoy all of the time. Brave people in my family and in our world will continue to join to protect our rights, usually those that we only see when they are threatened. In summary, there is such a thing as a just war. My mind has shifted greatly in this view. There is a way that we have been approaching these particular skirmishes lately that has kept in mind trying to preserve the life of American soldiers while taking out as few civilians as possible and as many people who are engaged in the government and in doing terrible things. That seems like the best way to approach this war. I will be the first to say that I've been surprised at how effective the Trump administration has been in targeting specific areas within the country. But one of the things that really struck me was prior to last year, the idea that the war in Israel with Gaza, that could even be ended, that just wasn't possible. The idea of ousting Maduro, that wasn't possible. The idea of doing anything about Iran other than appeasing them and continuing to do nothing about it, that was just the way things were going. And now things have shifted rapidly, and there's now the idea that Cuba could overcome its dictatorship its communist dictatorship. I mean, did you think that was a possibility? No. Now it is. Maybe it's not a large probability that everything will work out perfectly, but there's a possibility now. That is something worth celebrating. One of the things that I got from reflecting on all these ideas is a vast appreciation for people who do a lot more to contribute to America's defense and our freedom. The fact that I can spend all day, multiple days, recording podcasts with my kids living in comfort, learning rather than working, even though I can thank my husband for much of this too. He would also agree that we owe our lives to others. It is because of my grandparents and because of my dad and because of all the people, my cousin, other people who have fought in wars and given of themselves to protect my freedom. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. Thanks for listening today, and let me know if you have any questions.